WP-Get Web Dev Tutorials for all user levels. Alright, take two. It helps when you press the record button in OBS. So this is my initial foray into bricks, and as I suggested, I was going to translate some of the viewport detection animation code that I created for Elementor into bricks, which I've done. There's still some improvements to make, but I just wanted to make this video of where I'm at. It is going to be split into two sections. One is just the implementation, how you actually use it. And then I'm going to work through the actual code, which is a little bit detailed. So if you just want to know how to use it, then you might just want to watch the first part. If you want to know how it works, then you might want to watch the second part of this video. So I've constructed a very simple page in bricks. So I've just got some buffer text up here. And what I'm going to do is scroll down, and just below where this says simple animations, I've actually got a heading widget. And as I get that widget to within 20% of the bottom of the viewport, it animates in and up. And when it goes below, it animates down and out. That's it there. Now, I've got some other animations underneath, but just watch this particular one first. As I get to the top, get 20% from the top and it fades out. Within that, it comes back in. So within 20% from the top and 20% from the bottom, it animates in. Outside of that, it animates out. So the next one below, I've got animating in from the left. And you'll note that it's actually coming in a little bit higher up in the viewport. So around about this point here. So the other one was at 20%, so it's around about there. This one here doesn't come into about 40%, then it disappears there. So it's only got a smaller range when it's considered to be in the view. And we can change that using attributes. So we're using the browser's intersection observer, and we're looking at the entire viewport. And with that, you can set up margins, and you have to specify them in minus, because a positive margin means it's outside the viewport, and negative margin means it's inside. So by default, I'm looking at minus 20 from the top, minus 20% from the top, minus 20% from the bottom. We can make that whatever we like. We can make it 0. We can make it minus 40. We just want a small margin in the middle. If I made that minus 45, I'm going to have a 10% section in the middle where it's going to be considered to be in view. So that's the first part of it. The next part is this section down here. So what I've got is I've got 3 heading elements here that I'm tracking. And what I'm doing with those, the first one is not going to animate the actual heading, but it's going to throw a JavaScript event, which we use to change the background of this section. So as soon as that comes into the viewport, sorry, I've been mucking around with this. It was black, I changed the color to purple, sorry. So when the next one comes in, I'm going to have an animation that is a, what do they call it, highlighter effect behind it, and it's going to change the background to green. The next one, when that comes into view, changes it to blue, and we get the animation effect. So that's the effect that I want. So up here, all we're doing is applying an animation when it's in or out of the viewpoint. Here we're applying an animation and triggering a JavaScript event, which we're using to change the background. Coming down here, I've got another one here with this custom inline CSS. And what this is doing is it's tracking this container down here with these 2 icons in it. And then it's got some inline CSS to animate those 2 icons when it's considered to be in the view. So I've got this at 40% as well. So that's what we need to achieve. I'm going to show you how we actually do it. So for the first animation, what I want to note here is, so what I'm doing is tracking a container and then animating the first element in that container. And the reason I do that is because, let's say we're tracking this heading. If our animation has a Y translation up and down, it's going to move in and out of the viewport that we're detecting, and it's going to keep re-triggering the animation. So what I wanted to do is track the container that it's in, and then animate the first element that's in that container. So every animation we do needs to be wrapped in some sort of container, whether it's a section, block, div, whatever you want. It's got to be wrapped in that, which is where we apply our animation classes and attributes, and that will then animate the first element in that, underneath that. So if I wanted this to be a, if I go to that block there, and I wanted to have another block, what I would do is click on block. That puts another block inside there. Then I can put my heading inside that block. Everything that I put inside this block is going to animate at the same time. So, because that is the first child of this animated section up here. So, I hope that makes sense. Now, let's look at this first animation here and look at the content. So, look at this first animation here. We're tracking a block and we've got a heading inside that. So, the track container here, or block, we've added two classes, which is VPA track and VPA fade in up. Now we'll look at these when we look at the actual animation classes. The VPA track gets used by JavaScript to track that element when it enters or leaves the vertical viewport. And then it applies some classes to that, and it also fires an event as well. So if we look at the F12 here, and I look at this container, I'm looking at this block here, actually the one above it, that one there. So I've got my VPA track class I've added to there, and it says in view at the moment. If I scroll, oops, won't update when I'm clicking on it. If I scroll, so now this is going to be out of view. So I'm looking at this fading up 20%, and I'm looking down here and I'm saying that's in view. If I scroll a bit, it's out of view, and my in view's gone, and it's now got the out of view class. So scroll again. Oops, this Chrome doesn't update when you're in there. So just watching down here as I scroll, you can see that class is changing from in view to out of view. And that is what we're using to trigger our CSS animations. So it's as simple as creating a container, in this case a block, adding VPA, viewport animation track class, and then the animation class we actually want to use, and then putting the first child element, in this case, which is a heading, and it's going to animate that heading when this section is in view, and it's going to use that animation class VPA fade in up. So that's pretty simple right now. Let's have a look at the next one, which is this fade in up top. So there's another track block. In this case, we've got VPA track again. We've got the VPA fade in X. So that's a different animation class. So if you recall here, the first one is fade in up, and this one here fades in from the left. So it comes in from the left. Now the other thing we mentioned on here is that this one here has got 40% from the bottom, 40% from the top is the viewport where I want it to be in. So to change that, it's as simple as going into our style for that same block, going to the attributes. We're going to set a couple of data attributes. So data IO for intersection observer, top, minus 40%. Data IO, bottom, minus 40%. So I could make that, for example, 0, and let's see what happens with that. I'm only affecting this 40% one here. If I refresh that now, oh, I must have messed that up. Make it 0%. I think it has to be, that's right. So with the intersection observer, it only accepts pixels or percent. So now this one here is going to be 40% from the top. It's going to be out of animation, but it's going to go all the way to the bottom because we've set that to 0. Does that make sense? So 40% from the top, 0 from the bottom. So we've got 0 from the bottom and 40% from the top. So that's pretty much how we change where these things trigger vertically. Pretty simple. Now the other thing we've done is changed a property here. So we're using the style attribute to override some CSS variables. So I'm telling it to take 1 second to fade in over a distance of 100 pixels. If I made that, say, 200 pixels and make it 3 seconds to fade in, then have a look at this again. Slow. It's taking 3 seconds over a greater distance. So it's as simple as that. We override our style attribute with our CSS variables to change the way it behaves. Now, if I want it to be 200 pixels from the right, I set the distance to 200 pixels, not minus 200 pixels. There we go. So it's fading in over 3 seconds from the right. Pretty straightforward, right? All right, so the attributes are used for setting the IO top and IO bottom. We also have some, which I'll go through a little bit later when I talk about the code, where we can disable CSS animations or throwing of events based on whether it's a mobile, tablet, or desktop. And that would be done through these attributes here as well. So all we need to do, set a container with VPA track, VPA fade in X in this case, or whatever animation class you want to use. Change the viewport with our data IO top or data IO bottom. It's got to be in pixels or percentage. And if we want to change any of the, override any of the CSS variables for the animation, then we use the style attribute for that. So that's pretty much that. Now, if we go down to the next one. So the next triggers here, I've got this first one here. I'm going to animate that. Sorry, I'm not going to animate it, but I'm going to track it. But I'm going to throw a JavaScript event, and when I listen to that event, I'm going to tell it to change the background color of this section. So when it's in view, there we go. It's actually, I changed this when I was playing around with it, so it was black, now it's a purple color. The next one, when it comes into the viewport, I've got the background animation here for it to make it look like a highlighter, and the background goes green. Then the next one comes in, it animates with the background, and then we change the background color to blue. So with that, all I've done is added a VPA track to it. I have not added an animation class because I don't want to animate it. On the green one, I've added the VPA track and the VPA highlighter. On the blue one, it's the same. So these two have the highlighter effect because they've got the extra animation class. This one is just tracking. Actually, I might change that word to purple. That makes sense. And again, we put our animation classes and tracking on a container, and the part that we want to animate is the first child inside that container. All right, now we're going to look at this first one here and look at our attributes. So data IO top and bottom we already talked about. Color and target section ID are just unique to this particular animation I'm going to do, or sorry, this particular event. I should actually reorder that because these are the ones that actually we needed. And what we're doing is we're adding a data event prefix, and I'm calling that track color. Okay, so what this is going to do, when I add the event prefix of track color, when this comes into view, it's going to throw an event, and when it goes out of the view, it throws another event. If we have a look at our code here, where are we? So I'm looking at the page. So all I'm doing is saying from the window, add an event listener or track color. So that was the event prefix we put on this particular tracker, call it track color. And then it adds an underscore track view in. And when it goes out of the view, our prefix with an underscore, and then track view out. So what we're doing here is we're going, I got track view in. The event here is a custom event. The detail attribute is the intersection observer entry. Now entry has a target on it, and the target is the element that triggered the event. So in this case, over here, when this track purple one is triggered, it's going to send this DOM element as the target. So on that target, now I've got that in my JavaScript here. I'm now going to get the element by ID, the dataset target section ID. Here's my dataset target section ID, and I've called that BG color section. All right, so if I look at my actual section here, come over to that one. There we go. Remember what it was. So when I click on this grouped animations, which is a section, and I look up here, and on the top left, the ID is BG color section. So my class, so the track here, I'm telling it the ID is BG color section, which is the section that's grouping all of this. In my JavaScript, it's going to get BG color section, so it's going to find the section, then going to set the background color from the dataset color, which is this color that I set here, which is the purple. So we go to the green one, exactly the same. So we're using the same event prefix, same section ID, just a different color and the data color. So we're pulling that color off this attribute and applying that to the section with this ID. That's pretty much all this JavaScript is doing. Now this could be adding a body class so you can change some styling. It could be changing the logo in the header. It could be opening up a pop-up or playing a video or whatever you want it to be. This event can be used to trigger, and you can easily tell it how you want it to behave just by adding data attributes to that. So that's that section there. That's the section here. So the next section is a custom with inline CSS. So if I look at this, as soon as this comes within 40% of the viewport, I've got two icons animating in different directions. It gets outside of the viewport, two icons animating, stop. All right, now instead of creating a CSS class with that, that could be a section where you might animate an icon, fade in some text, and maybe apply a drop shadow. So it's unique to this particular block. You don't want to create a global animation class to apply to everything. All you do is for this inline animation, that's just the section there. We're going to go down to the block that we're actually tracking. And all I've done is added a VPA track with no animation class, and I've given it an ID of inline track. So this whole block has the ID inline track. And then in my attributes, I've got my data IO top and bottom of 40%. Then I've got some custom CSS. There's some bugs with I'm finding. Let me just do a Control F5, see if this fixes it. There's some strange bugs happening in this Bricks editor for when you're looking at these CSS. It keeps putting in old values, and I'm not sure why. Let's go back to it again. CSS. That's not the current CSS. If I look in the front end here, so the current CSS for that is spin left, the index here. So the keyframe to spin left, spin right. But what it's showing in the editor is old information. So no, sorry, no, it's not. Some reason it replaced. When I tried root previously, the CSS just completely disappeared in the editor. But what I did here is I replaced that with the hash inline track. Just do it again. Instead of root, I replaced that with hash inline track. Save that. It's working. If I refresh this, yeah, it's replaced my hash inline track with the keyword root. So there's some stuff in here that's overriding. Probably it's detecting that ID was the same, so I just put the word root in there. The reason I didn't ID is because when I put root in there in the first place, and then I went back to look at my CSS, it was completely blank. So there's some bug in there. I'm not sure exactly what it is yet, but this seems to be working okay now. Now, I generally don't advocate doing this. I have a preference for how I work, and it is to not put any custom CSS inside these editors because it can get really, really confusing. So my go-to would normally be, I'll put that back in there, inline track. There's that word there. Just going to cut it out of there, save, and make sure that this isn't working anymore. Yep, so the CSS isn't working. Generally what I would do is use a code manager. I'm using WP Codebox, and I would create something specifically for that page. So I've got some JavaScript on that page. I'm just going to create a new snippet for CSS, and I'll call it some of the inline CSS will do. We'll call it it's a CSS type, it's inline, and we're going to paste that CSS in here. And what we'll then do is on the conditions, we're just going to tell it we only want it on that page. Is the current page of Viewport animation, and then that's only going to, oops. So we're only going to have that on that page. Save that, enable it, and then drag that. I should rename that to Viewport. So that's the name of the page. And stick that in this folder. So for my pages, I just go in there. Now, unfortunately, with this WP Codebox, you can't create subfolders. Otherwise, I'd create page names and stick them in there. So you just got to give them names. So I would stick it in here rather than putting it into the editor, because they generally tend to be quirky, and you also find that it's can be hard to actually find where you put your code. I'm just going to refresh this now, and that is not working. Oh, that's the other thing I found. When you clear the CSS rules here, it resets the ID, which is a bit of a surprise. So I'm going to put that back in there. What do I call it? Inline track. Oops. Save that. So now my block has got the ID of inline track. I don't have any CSS in here, but if I refresh my viewport, it's working. That's just a personal preference. Just find that there's too many places inside these editors where you can put custom CSS. You can put it on the page settings, on an element, on a block, on whatever, and it just gets really, really confusing as to finding where your CSS was actually loaded. A better way for me is using something like this, where you manage all of your CSS and JavaScript and PHP in the one location, and just give your sections either class names or IDs to make that work. So that's pretty much it as far as how we get these things working. So we've looked at, so far we've looked at a simple animation by just adding the WP track and an animation name. We've looked at changing the viewport using attributes, and also changing some of the CSS variables for that animation. So in this case, we made it, I think we said it was 200 pixels on the right and a 3-second time frame to animate in. And then we looked at this one where we're throwing an event, and then we're listening to that event with JavaScript to change something. In this case, the background color. Could be anything you like. And then we got another one with some inline CSS where we can do many things in there. We can animate multiple items in that same box if we want to. Now, there is another thing which I haven't mentioned, I just realized, is I've got 2 classes that we can apply. I haven't prepared an example here, but you can also add other elements with VPA no track. Now, what VPA no track does, you apply all of these same. Where are we? So if I put VPA no track on that, let's actually look at one of these up here. So this particular item here, if we put VPA no track and VPA fade in X on that, it will track. Sorry, it won't track when it's in the viewport, but it will apply all of the animation. So the class from animations here, and also the attributes. So under the style here, any of these attributes. So these attributes will apply to the child of that container. If you use VPA no track, it just doesn't track it when you're in the viewport. And the way we deal with that, let's say, for example, you might have a section and you've got an icon in here, and when that icon comes within the viewport, you want to trigger other animations in there. So you don't want to track everything, you just want to track one thing and then trigger a bunch of other stuff once that's tracked. So the way we do that is we add VPA no track, and then we use JavaScript to make it work. So what have we got here? So in this example, what we could do is, I'm just going to show you a very quick JavaScript example. So what we're going to do is look at the target. We're going to put elements equals the target. So which element triggered this? So that was being tracked. Dot get. Query. All. Query select all. We're looking for VPA no track. So we're looking for VPA no track classes, okay? So again, they will have all of the same attributes as this, except for they won't animate in the viewport. They need to be manually triggered. So we'll have a section, for example, here, which has got the, let's say we're tracking that section, we'd have VPA track on that section, which will trigger an event. And then on that event, we look for all of the VPA no track elements in here, and we tell them to trigger. So let's have a look how we do that. What we do is we get all of those, and then we go through the elements for each. Use an ES6, so I'll just go EL as an example. So now we're looking at every single element that we find underneath the target that's got VPA no track. Okay, and then I've got another little class in here, which I'll show you when I get to go through the another method. I'm just going to find this. So if I grab that on the window, so we go window dot set in view EL. Okay. So we'll talk about this when I work through the code, but basically what this is going to do is goes, okay, the target that triggered it, so is it this section that triggered it? Find all the all the VPA no track elements in here, iterate through all of those, and then tell it to set that as being in view, which will then add the correct classes, and it'll send the send triggers as well, JavaScript triggers as well. So JavaScript events as well. And then all we do on the other side, grab that, And instead of saying set in view, we say set out of view. Okay, so this is a manual way so that the VPA-track automatically processes a element as it goes in and out of a view, and it'll add the in-view class or the out-of-view class and throw an event. The VPA no track does not do that. We manually trigger those to be in view or out of view just by calling these methods here. Those. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it's extremely powerful. I think that it opens up the viewport to so many things, everything from changing colors, changing backgrounds, reanimating other sections, changing tabs, starting or stopping a video. Pretty much whatever you want to do, you can do. If we do it simply, it is just a simple animation. If we do it with events, then it gets a bit more powerful and we can do a lot more things. If we do it with inline CSS, we can animate multiple things and we can even put delays and triggers and etc. on them. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to put into this part of it is the actual animations. Now, if we look at the viewport animations here, so by default, what we're saying is anything that's got VPA track or VPA no track, if it hasn't been initialized, now JavaScript initializes this and adds that class after they've been processed. We want the opacity to be 0. So at the beginning, before it's been initialized, we don't want to see it. We want it to be blank. We do not want it to get in the way of seeing flashes of content and then it disappears. Right. Now, for the moment, this is my method for making it work in the bricks editor. Now, it also stops it from working in the preview as well. So probably need to come up with a better way of doing this. But what we're saying is if it's not in the bricks front end and it's not initialized, then set our opacity to 1, transform to none, and clip path to unset. That is so we can see these in the editor. So if this starts off at its starting point of being opacity of 0, maybe rotated or whatever, we're not going to be able to see or edit that in the editor. So this resets those critical properties, and you may need to change this depending on what your animations are. We then set some common variables that we can override. These are all pretty self-explanatory. And then we start creating our actual animation classes. So let's go with the first one. VPA fade in up. So that is this first one here, fading up. That one down the bottom there, fades in up by 30 pixels. Pretty simple, right? So all we're doing is saying we want a distance of 30 pixels. We want, if it's in the bricks front end, we want to take the first child. So remember I mentioned that we're not animating the actual element, we're tracking an element and then we're animating the first child. Okay, and that can be another container if you want more stuff in there. So we're setting the initial state of that. So the initial state for the fade in up is it's translating the Y over the distance. So it's 30 pixels down the screen. If we wanted to change this to fade in Y, let's actually change that because it makes more sense. Because you can change the property in it. Y. Okay, so I've just changed this class here to WPA fade in Y. Save that. Get back to my editor and this first one here. I'm going to change that to. Oh, just realized I've got a class one that I don't need. Okay, come back to here. I'm going to change that to VPA fade in Y. Okay, so I've now got a VPA fade in Y. Save and just double check that it's still working. Yeah, faded in up. Right, to make this different, all we have to do is on that particular track block. We don't have any attributes. So we want to add an attribute. We call it style. We're going to set the distance to maybe minus 120 px. Have a look at that now. That's fading in by 120 pixels from the top. So we've changed that whole direction just by overriding this distance here. So let's make it really extreme. Let's make it, say, 500 pixels. And maybe we'll change the timing of it. So let's have a look back over to our classes here. Transform in. Timing is on 0.5 seconds. Grab that. And let's make that, say, 2 seconds. So we're going to go over 500 pics over a 2-second duration. I'd never do this as an animation, but this is just to demonstrate the point. All right, so we look in here as soon as it comes in, 500 pixels over what I say, 2 seconds. There we go. And when we get out there, all right, so it's as simple as that. And we can overwrite any of these here, the opacity duration, start and end, transform in duration, which is when it's saying that's in the view, transform out duration, so that's when it's going out of the view, and our timing function is all the default stuff that we can add there. And all I did to create the second animation, this one here, this fade in, that should say left, I've got the wrong wording there now. To change that to an X is I basically grabbed those 3 classes, I copied those, pasted them down here, changed that to X, and then changed that to translate X, and translate X there. That's all I did to create the fade in X animation class. Rotate, same thing. We just added a couple of extra variables. We've got the scale. Actually, let's change that. Let's try putting that on this first one. Go back to the block. Instead of fade in Y, let's do a... Okay, rotate left, fade in. All right. Save that. Here we go. So it's rotating from the left and fading in. Okay. Now, let's have a look at why that's taking so long. It's because we've overridden the distance, which we're not using, and we've overridden the transform. I'm going to get rid of that distance because we don't use that on here. I'm going to make that 1 second. And let's say we want to change the rotation. So the rotate start is -8 degrees. And the scale start is 0.5. So let's go to there. So we're going to go... okay, so just had a little bit of a mess up with some code here. So I just had to go back and look at that, but I've fixed it now. So if we're looking here at the animation here, we've got a scale start and a rotate start. So in my CSS for the override, I've got a transform duration of 1 second. I've got a scale start of 10 and a rotate start of -60 degrees. And if we have a look at the animation now, that's very big with a very big rotation. We change that to, say, 180 degrees. The rotate start to 180 degrees. Come back and have a look now. 180 degrees. There we go. So it's as simple as that. To override these properties, you create your own animations by doing 3 points, for example, the zoom, called VPA big zoom in, scale start, scale in, for additional properties. You have a starting point and an ending point. these parts here are pretty much the same. It's just how you're scaling it, or how you're transforming that changes. Different with the clip reveals. We're using polygons for the clip reveal, so I've had to add additional transition path in here. But you make your own innovations. So really, it's changing your CSS, adding sets of these classes to your CSS, and then basically in the editor, all you have to do is tell it which one of those you want to use, and then set the attributes for how you want this to work as far as viewport animation from the top or bottom. So I'll leave it at that, and what I'll do is a second video where I go more in detail into how the actual code works. I'll put a link to a GitHub in the description, and there's a folder in there for bricks, and it's got all three of all four, I should say, of these here. So the breakpoint CSS, JavaScript for the breakpoint, some starter animations, and the JavaScript that you need for the animations to work. And it's yeah, so feel free to use it. Let me know if you think I can improve on anything in here, or should improve on anything in here, or if you've got some ideas for what we can do with this. I'll make that other video later today with a bit more detail for those that are interested, and I hope you enjoy this.